Thanks very much for doing that. Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Pedrosa, and I'm honored to be here, and really delighted as well to be chairing and moderating this panel discussion, which is so very timely. I most recently presenter and correspondent for Al Jazeera English, based in KL, Bangkok, and at some points in Doha, but I've also worked for CNN and for the BBC. Currently based here and helping out Abdullah when I can. In any case, I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Arab Organization for Human Rights in the UK. We'll be hearing more about them shortly. I'd also like to thank the venue for accommodating us. What a wonderful place it is. Chandos House has a storied history. There is a leaflet, if you want to know more, that I can share with you, and I'm sure the people downstairs would want to share with you too. Can I ask you to comply with some house rules? One of them is to please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent, particularly because, I don't know if you're aware, but we're live streaming this discussion on Al Jazeera Mubasher, and I think we'll get a look in at Al Jazeera English if I'm informed correctly. Emergency exits are clearly marked. Chatham House rules do not apply, and we have no fire drills planned, so if you hear an alarm, leave. Now, to the theme of tonight's event. As I mentioned, it's timely and important in view of global changes and developments. The theme, as you know, is the impact of UK-Saudi arms trade in light of the Jamal Khashoggi killing and the war on Yemen. Today was the first day of talks in Sweden that some of the warring party, the Houthi warring parties in Yemen attended. I'm not sure if there's a top line yet out of those talks from Sweden. Not that I've heard from. I'll check and see. I'll keep you updated like a proper news person if there's anything that comes out. But what we want to do here is to examine and analyze the UK's quote-unquote special relationship with Saudi Arabia and why successive UK governments have failed to reverse government policy on arms trade in Saudi Arabia, despite their glaring misuse of weapons. We all know too well the consequences and impact of the arms that are supplied to Saudi Arabia, namely the brutality that we have seen against civilians in Yemen. The Saudi role in the region and internationally ought to be focused much more due to the worsening human rights situation, in our view, in the country, especially under the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I'm going to call him MBS. The world was shocked to learn about the gruesome murder of the journalist, as I've mentioned, Jamal Khashoggi, in Istanbul a few weeks ago, and evidence points to MBS for ordering Jamal's murder. Indeed, Saudi investigations have found Saudi personnel responsible. So where does this leave journalists and campaigners concerned about human rights in the region is one of the questions that we're going to ask. So this could not come, this seminar could not come sooner. The Arab Organization for Human Rights is a non-government organization that works to promote human rights culture in the world, advocates human rights in general, and the rights of Arab citizens in particular. You can visit www.aohr.org.uk to find out more about the work of the organization. And finally, let me thank you for responding to our invitation to be here tonight to listen to our distinguished lineup of speakers. What I'll do is ask for, between now and 8:20 or 8:30, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak uninterrupted. After that, we will have a discussion session at about, I'm hoping at about 7:45. Each of our speakers will be speaking for 10 to 15 minutes. Let me ask Hannah Phillips, who is a researcher at the Arab Organization for Human Rights, which focuses, as I say, on human rights challenges in the Middle East, to provide opening remarks. Thank you, Hannah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for such a great introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening and to our esteemed panel, because we're going to have a great discussion. So I'm just going to start us with an opening statement on behalf of the Arab Organisation for Human Rights. So as we know, we're here to talk about the UK weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the implications that they're having in the conflicts in Yemen, and especially in light of the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So we know that the UK sells billions of pounds worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. I think 4.7 billion since the conflict in Yemen started in 2015. These weapons are being used regularly to kill and injure thousands of civilians. They're destroying vital infrastructure and being used for the bombardment of schools and hospitals, which are leaving thousands of children and civilians on the brink of starvation. Over 10 million children and 75% of the overall population of Yemen need urgent humanitarian assistance, which is becoming increasingly difficult, particularly with the bombardment of ports like Hadiyah. In total, 56,000 Yemenis have been killed as a result of the military action. It's probably quite a conservative estimate. And 3 million Yemenis have been internally displaced, and a further 85,000 under the age of 5 have died as a result of starvation. The Arab Organisation for Human Rights in the UK is vehemently opposed to this trade that sponsors UK-made weapons which are being used to kill and harm civilians. Since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi on the 2nd of October this year, Western European states have done very little to put tangible pressure on the regime or to form formal investigative measures that come to any kind of conclusive conclusion as to who is responsible for the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Paradoxically, the CIA's assessment into Mohammed bin Salman is who is directly responsible for the murder of Jamal, has not been acted upon. This has undoubtedly encouraged Mohammed bin Salman and his regime to continue their actions unabated. The Arab Organisation for Human Rights in the UK is deeply concerned that this will lead to further human rights abuses that are buried without formal accountability measures taking place. The international community must stand against Saudi Arabian violations of the rights and freedoms which it seeks to safeguard and uphold. What is more, given the continuity in the violations of human rights practiced by the new regime, the reformist agenda presented by bin Salman must be taken to and interrogated sufficiently, and tangible action must be taken to deter the continuity of human rights abuses under the guise of reform. We call for an open and honest discussion into Saudi Arabia's position on the UN Human Rights Council. And we condemn in the strongest terms Saudi Arabia's systematic violation of human rights, both internally and externally. Tactics that are employed, such as arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, and torture, have led to the death of numerous individuals detained without charge and represent a clear violation and rejection of international law. Given that many scholars, activists, and academics are still detained by Saudi authorities, the Arab Organisation for Human Rights in the UK calls for an end to the UK-Saudi arms industry, the Saudi-led war on Yemen, and the internal violations of human rights abuses, which Saudi Arabia then have been exasperated under the bin Salman regime. Thank you very much, and I think we are going to hear next. Let's see.
We are indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. Luckily, we didn't have to switch around because slipping gracefully into place was Andrew Smith from CAAT, which has been widely quoted on the actual arms trade. Andrew's the media coordinator and spokesperson for the Campaign Against Arms Trade, and he's advised and worked on press and media strategy for a range of companies and charities, and he writes about politics and culture. And I'm hoping, Andrew, to hear from you on the impact of UK arms sale to Saudi Arabia and the work of CAAT.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Arab Organisation for Human Rights in the UK for organising this event. Thank you very much to everybody for attending, because I think this is a very important discussion to be having and a very important time to be having it. I'd like to start by apologising for my tardiness. It turns out that I may be able to do things on the media front, but reading maps is not one of them. So what should have been a 5-minute walk from the tube station took about 25. But throughout this meeting, we're going to undoubtedly hear about the severe, terrible atrocities which have been inflicted on the people of Yemen over almost 4 years of brutal bombardment. We will hear in detail about the horrendous murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the abuses which are carried out against Saudi people every single day and have been for decade upon decade. But the weapons which have been used in the bombardment of Yemen, they might be getting used thousands of miles away, but many of them are made here in the UK. Many of them have been licensed by civil servants and politicians who work not very far away from here. They work, in fact, about 4 tube stations away from here. And they have continued to license these arms no matter how bad the situation has got, no matter how many people have been murdered in this terrible war. But it's not just the people who have been killed by the bombardment directly, which is tens of thousands of people in itself. It has been many more who have been killed as a result of the humanitarian catastrophe. And when we hear about this catastrophe on television, we're often told that people are starving to death. But they're not starving, they're being starved. They're not dying, they're being killed. And it is a man-made catastrophe, and many of the men who have made those catastrophes have been armed and supported from right here in the UK. In fact, the man who has arguably played the greatest role in this catastrophe was welcomed to the UK this February when Mohammed bin Salman was greeted with red carpet treatment. He was given lunch with the Queen. He had his photo taken on the steps of Downing Street with its present occupant, who may not be its occupant by the end of this meeting. And he had dinner with Prince William. Now, all of this was a propaganda coup for him. This was the images which were taken in Buckingham Palace that day, the images taken on the steps of Downing Street, will have been broadcast all around the world. And the message which they will have sent to the Saudi ruling elites will have been a total vote of confidence. They will have been a firm rubber stamp of UK approval for everything which the regime was doing and of the people who were doing it against. However, the message which it would have sent to people who are living in oppression in Saudi Arabia, to people who are being tortured, to people who've been detained, to people who are being abused, was a very different message. The message it will have sent to them is that their human rights don't matter. It will have told them that their lives are less important than arms sales and profits for BAE Systems and the other arms companies who have made a fortune, who have made a killing from their support for the Saudi regime and for their support for the terrible war which has been inflicted on Yemen. The message it will have sent to the people of Yemen is one of total contempt as well. The message it has sent to them is that no matter how bad this humanitarian catastrophe gets, no matter how many atrocities are inflicted, no matter how many schools are bombed, no matter how many hospitals are bombed, the British government doesn't care. It will welcome the tyrant who has overseen this bombardment. It will try to sell them as many weapons as possible, and it will give them a fig leaf of legitimacy and respectability on the world stage. That is the message which that visit sent. And ultimately, what we saw in the terrible murder of Jamal Khashoggi was characteristic of a regime which has already shown a contempt for human rights, a regime which has quite routinely ignored international humanitarian law in its appalling bombardment of Yemen. And this is the backdrop of the murder. It's a regime which, for contempt for human rights, carrying out yet another atrocity. It is definitely welcome that some European governments are reconsidering their support for the regime. We have seen moves to curb arms sales in Denmark. We've seen them in Holland. We have seen them in Finland. And we're seeing them from Germany, which is possibly more significant. However, these arms sales should never have been allowed in the first place. It should not take the murder of a journalist for people to question if it's right or wrong to arm a dictatorship. It should not take the murder of a journalist for people to question if it is right or wrong to arm and support one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world while it inflicts the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world onto the poorest country in the region over a prolonged 4-year period in a war with no end in sight, unfortunately. And that is the backdrop to the murder which took place. Now, we have absolutely no question in our minds no doubt in our minds that these arms sales from the UK are not just immoral, they're also illegal. You may be aware that we've been in the High Court arguing this case. Now, on paper, UK arms export criteria is very clear. It says that if there is, and I quote, a clear risk that weapons might be used in a serious violation of international humanitarian law, then arms sale should not go ahead. Now, Saudi Arabia has been routinely accused by the United Nations, by Oxfam, by Amnesty International, by almost every single NGO with people on the ground of carrying out some of the most grotesque and serious violations of international humanitarian law right from the start of this terrible war. Unfortunately, the High Court did not come down on our side when it ruled in 2017, but we've been given permission to appeal earlier this year and will be in the Court of Appeal next year. If we win the case, which will take place next April, it will set a major precedent. It will end arms exports from the UK for use in Yemen, because right now, the fighter jets flying over Yemen, many of them are made here. Right now, the bombs, many of them being dropped from the sky, are made in the UK. Many of the missiles are made in the UK. Without the fundamental military support of the UK and the United States, this war would not be possible. The Saudi Air Force literally could not fly its planes. The war could not continue. And so we have to remember that. This is a war which has been led by the Saudi military, but supported every single step of the way from right here in Westminster. And that is characteristic of the hypocrisy at the heart of UK foreign policy. It is a foreign policy which we're told is focused on human rights and democracy, but in reality is perpetuating a grotesque war fought by one of the least democratic regimes in the world, which has shown a continuous disregard for human rights right from the start. Now, if we win in April, it will set a major precedent, but if things carry on as they are, thousands and thousands of people will die between now and April. They will be killed needlessly as part of this terrible war. We need to continue the political pressure which is built up with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and make sure that we are even more active in calling for change and leading in, and hopefully causing MPs and leading MPs into calling for change themselves, because ultimately we know where public opinion stands on this. Poll after poll has shown that the overwhelming majority of people across this country are firmly opposed to these arms sales and are firmly opposed to the UK's uncritical political and military support for the regime. But that needs to manifest itself in policy, that needs to manifest itself in change, because ultimately politics is about a choice, it's about whose side you're on. And in this case, our politicians need to consider, are they on the sides of the people who are suffering this terrible war, or on the sides of those who are inflicting it? Are they on the side of the people being tortured by this terrible regime, or on the side of the people who are continuously carrying out these abuses? We know whose side we're on, and unfortunately it looks like we know very much whose side Theresa May and her colleagues are on as well. It's time to change that, it's time to change policy. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew Smith. Just to provide a little more detail on one of the things that you spoke about, the latest poll, I believe, by YouGov for Save the Children and Avaz was published on Tuesday, the 11th of September, I believe. And it found that 13% of the British public, 1/3, supported the sale of weapons to the Saudis, whereas 63% opposed them. It also indicated less than 1 in 6 people, or 14%, think that the UK's role in supporting the Saudi-UAE-led coalition reflects British values and interests. All right, let's turn now to our next speaker, and it is Ben Smith. Hang on a second. Ben Keith, excuse me. Ben Keith is going to talk to us about the Saudi killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the motives and implications for human rights in the region and beyond. He's a barrister at 5 St Andrews Hill, and he specializes in human rights and extradition proceedings in post-Soviet states, including Russia and Azerbaijan, associate lecturer in human rights at Birkbeck College and of the University of London, of course. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I wanted to talk a bit about how international law bears upon the Saudi-UK arms trade, and in particular, I've been asked to look at how the killing of Jamal Khashoggi highlights the ability and willingness of the Saudi regime and similar regimes such as the UAE to completely ignore international law. Jamal Khashoggi was a journalist writing for the Washington Post, and his job was to shine a light upon Saudi injustice and to criticize the Saudi regime. He spent much of his time criticizing Mohammed bin Salman and the regime for their frequent and flagrant human rights abuses. This case and what we're doing and our discussion tonight highlights, and I echo Andrew's ideas on this, is that this is propaganda. There's been propaganda on both sides. Jamal Khashoggi and human rights campaigners are trying to explain what is going on inside a closed regime, Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia are pretending that nothing is going wrong, and the international community are, in most respects, trying to cover up the flagrant human rights abuses that are taking place within Saudi Arabia. You only have to look very briefly at the argument in the United States over the CIA's report into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi to see that the CIA and factions of the United States seem to have decided quite clearly that Mohammed bin Salman was responsible for the ordering of the death of Jamal Khashoggi, but the Trump administration, for political reasons, has decided not to come out in direct criticism of MBS because that will obviously impact upon the arms trade and its relationship with Saudi Arabia. And so there you have the conundrum that faces the international community in relation to the breaches of international law. And in general, the international community can ignore or tends to ignore some of the human rights abuses that take place in Saudi Arabia. But they have not been able to ignore the flagrant breach of international law, which was the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in the embassy in Istanbul. And as we know, he went into the embassy in order to gain documents in order to allow him to be divorced from his wife in Saudi Arabia in order to marry his fiancée. He'd previously gone there and been told to come back a month later. It's widely reported that a death squad, 15 men or so, came from Saudi Arabia to meet him when he went into the embassy. There, we understand, they killed, tortured, and disposed of his body using horrific methods, probably dismembering him. We don't know the exact location of his body, or whether, in fact, his body still exists in any form that we can find. Why is that so scary? Well, it's scary firstly because of the sheer brutality that was used. The brutality must, in my opinion, have been used to send a message to anybody who wants to, who dares to stand up to Saudi Arabia. Killing somebody is not that difficult, but killing, dismembering, disposing of a body with a detailed and sophisticated operation is a very different matter. This was premeditated, in my opinion, and the terrifying aspect of it is not just the brutality, but that it took place in an embassy. Now, of course, we say, well, it's the Saudi Arabian embassy, but the point about embassies is that they are the bedrock of international law, and the whole basis of international law is that countries agree to abide by a set of rules. One of those rules is that consulates and embassies are sacrosanct, and that you can't enter them, which is why the Turkish government didn't enter the Saudi embassy. Although, of course, we now know that the Turkish embassy, the Turkish government obviously had quite clear access to recordings and details of what was going on in the embassy. But effectively, it was a Saudi Arabian controlled property that the Turkish government, the Turkish police force, could not go into in order to investigate this case properly. It should have been a place of sanctuary for anybody involved, and to deliberately bring government officials to kidnap somebody inside an embassy and then to kill and dismember them breaches every tenet of international law and human rights. It's that brazenness that is difficult to fathom, because at least luckily there was a significant public outcry from the press and then following from politicians as to the brutality and the sheer gall of MBS and the death squad in killing Jamal Khashoggi. But as yet there have been very few consequences other than a continual pressure from press and NGOs and some governments now to shine a light on the abuses that are taking place in Saudi Arabia, and we hope that tonight we can continue to place some of that pressure and light upon what's going on there. We still don't really know what's going on in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I've been asked to look at the impact of human rights in Saudi Arabia and the region, but in reality we know that fair trial, at least by Western standards, doesn't take place in Saudi Arabia, and that torture and killing are standard practices in criminal investigations. There have been a number of significant and credible reports that in fact the UAE-Saudi coalition are operating secret prisons within Yemen. So there are prisons established within Yemen where Saudi nationals and UAE nationals are being spirited away to be tortured and never seen again, which is pretty extraordinary considering that we don't really know what happens in Saudi Arabia in any event. Saudi Arabia, in terms of human rights access, is a closed country. One can see that if the Crown Prince is prepared to kill and dismember a journalist who's trying to shine light on corruption and human rights abuses, it is exceptionally difficult for anybody who lives in Saudi Arabia to even attempt to criticize the regime, let alone investigate it in any way. Those are the fundamental tenets of human rights, that when an abuse happens, that you have the ability to investigate it, to prosecute it, and to bring some justice to both the aggrieved and to the to the victims, and also to make sure that the persons accused have a fair trial. It seems likely that the men who have been identified as the death squad, some of them will be put on show trial, some of them will confess, I suspect, and all of them will exonerate MBS as being part of the hierarchy, because that is the culture that is pursued. The Saudi government is prepared to use murder, kidnapping, and lie to the international community about what happened in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, and that is a terrifying prospect for everybody trying to campaign for the removal of an analysis of the arms trade, to shine light on the abuses that are happening there, because it shows that MBS is prepared to authorize reprisals of terrible force and attack people not just in Saudi Arabia but in foreign countries, and he has done so with impunity. Whilst there has been criticism thus far, nobody has yet really given any ultimatums to the Saudis in order to try and prevent future attempts like this on the lives of other journalists or campaigners. I think that's probably.
Thanks very much indeed. Yes. Some really dark facts being brought into the light there. Thank you. Professor Paul Reynolds is our next speaker. He's the International Relations and Economics Advisor, including Chief Political Advisor to Iraq, to the Iraq Coalition Forces, the UK Advisor in Afghanistan, GCC, Jordan, Kuwait, China, Russia, and Djibouti opposition groups. He's also a member of the Liberal International BLG Executive. I think that says BIG Executive. And he'll be talking to us about examining the UK's special relations with Saudi Arabia. Did you come up with that description, special relations? And why? Do you want to use that, Mike?
Sure, yes. I hope my voice, well, I'm losing my voice, as you can see. If it goes completely, then I'll have to give up.
You don't have to talk loudly, just quietly into
Yeah,
the mic, you'll be fine.
I'll do what I can, but you might find my voice goes completely, and it's not a SIS plot. There you are. I want to just make some very brief points about the context here. First of all, the question of the importance and leverage of Saudi Arabia as a regime, if you like, and people believe that, most people, believe that Saudi's influence comes from the size of its oil production, but it does go a lot further than that, in particular being the guarantor of the petrodollar. And those of you who have studied economic history will know very well that the US dollar used to be gold-backed, and in the early 70s it was no longer backed by gold, and to replace that they backed it by the petrodollar, which means that countries around the world have to pay in dollars when they buy oil. And that means that everyone has to hold dollars, and Saudi Arabia became the guarantor, as the largest oil supplier, became the guarantor of that system, and its leadership of OPEC, de facto leadership of OPEC, plays a role in that. So that gives Saudi Arabia very substantial leverage, even more leverage at the moment when the dollar is under some considerable pressure. And those of you that follow the markets will see that things are not going very well, especially for US economy. And I think it's quite staggering to me as an economist to see the United States, whose overall debt will exceed 105% of GDP this fiscal year coming, and at a time when people are trying to, like China and Russia, are trying to escape from the dollar. So therefore their leverage is considerably increased when the petrodollar system, which enables the Americans to inflate and spend money on arms, is under, the whole thing's under threat. So I want to put that as a kind of important part of context here. The UK military relationship essentially started in the 1960s with supplies of Lightning aircraft and this type of thing, and then from 1986 up to 2006, over that 20-year period, there was a thing called the Al Yamamah deal, which British people will be familiar with, and the British had a serious difficulty and were fined, or BAE was fined $400 million for its behavior in this series of contracts. And this is a case where there was an investigation by the Serious Fraud Office in the UK under Blair, and there was found to be the most extraordinary corruption, including very, very large sums being transferred allegedly to Bandar at the time. And but this was quashed, the whole, it didn't proceed to a conclusion, because under Blair there was so much pressure on the UK that they dropped the whole fraud pursuit. But there is something important about this Al Yamamah deal and the 5 billion, nearly 5 billion arms sales since the Yemen war began, which is that there is an element in Washington which has always been very nervous about the Saudi relationship, including those on the, if you like, the other side of the Potomac, as it's often called, who are very concerned about US relations. And so the British have exploited this somewhat equivocation, historic equivocation in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s in selling arms to Saudi Arabia. And so the British have stepped in and exploited that for financial reasons, and the British security institutions have had a wonderful time organizing and supporting and suppressing opposition to these arms deals of lots of people have become wealthy, including husband of the current Prime Minister, partially. So then we come to the question of Yemen, which, as people have rightly said, is a blot. I think it's fair to say is a blot on the history of this nation-state United Kingdom in its support for the Yemen war and the British arms which have been used in that war. But I'd just like to say something about the Yemen war in terms of and other people have mentioned the tragedy of it, but it's not just arms sales to Saudi Arabia which are regrettable. The British have been involved in refueling aircraft, they have been involved in the targeting, Saudi targeting, they've had trainers in Riyadh. In fact, until they reduced the size of it, they had an office, I think General Abizaid was involved, they had an office in Riyadh, quite a big team there with all their kit and computers and whatnot, mostly US military folk, planning for the war and so on, and helping with the targeting and helping with the SIGINT and the HUMINT and this type of thing. So the support goes beyond just the arms sales, and the word regrettable is used in a terribly British way, but it certainly is the case that before the war in 2015 there was a deal on the table which the various parties were pretty much agreeing to in Yemen, which was scuppered by the current belligerents. So I think it's it sounds a bit outlandish, but I think it's a fair conclusion, and will be in history, that the possibility of peace in Yemen was deliberately scuppered in order to facilitate the war. That sounds a little bit an exaggerated statement, but I think that from my knowledge of the detail, that is a fair conclusion. So I'll just skip through a couple of other, and these are obviously the issues we're going to be discussing in a minute. I'll just skip through a couple of other issues. One is something not mentioned very often is the Arms Trade Treaty, and the UK and France are signatories to the Arms Trade Treaty, but the US is not. Arms Trade Treaty signatories have supplied $25 billion worth of arms since the beginning of the war.
Sorry, I didn't hear that very well. Billion.
25 billion. And so many of the signatories of the Arms Trade Treaty have taken the treaty quite seriously and have withdrawn because they are clearly in breach of the treaty. It's an international treaty, and we have to thank my colleague Mark Rutte and the Belgian government and the Danish government and others for their unequivocal ban on supplies of arms to Saudi Arabia. The Germans and the Spanish have, at least, in the headline sense, agreed to a ban on arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but there has been a lot of lobbying, and then the Germans have made some exceptions, and the Spanish have pulled back to an extent as well. So the lobbying has been quite effective in trimming the at least sort of headline bans from some countries in the European Union. Of course, the Yemen war has raised the matter of arms sales to Saudi Arabia as a, kind of generally a bad thing, but it has taken, as you rightly said, it has taken the murder of a journalist who is very well known and regarded as rather clubbable in the bars of Washington, D.C., to raise alarm about what's going on in Yemen. So it's a great tragedy, but there has been some benefit. I just want to raise those points briefly, and would be happy to discuss detail forthwith. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Paul. I've actually, we've actually got a little bit of time in hand, so if you don't mind, is it all right if I ask him a quick question before we go on to you, Mahan? Yeah, I just wanted to, there's a I was looking back on the statements that the Prime Minister's office made after her meeting with MBS, and I think significantly part of the statement said, quote, "The Prime Minister reiterated UK support for Saudi Arabia's security. It's very much a security relationship. That's almost all that this relationship's about. And then, including the very real threats posed by Iranian interference in Yemen." And I know I don't want to get too bogged down, but this is an important element, of course, in the way that the UK looks at the region.
If you look at most of the main news services, Reuters is especially guilty of this. They always put Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. Well, this is a very successful propaganda campaign, I would say, because all of those people I know that don't have a particular cross to bear, that have spent a lot of time in Yemen, my time in Yemen is not extensive, have said, well, it's very difficult to find any evidence of Iranian involvement. And it really is, one thing that's quite interesting is the United Nations representative who conducted a recent inquiry, he has...
Martin Griffiths?
No, not Martin Griffiths. No, he appointed, Professor Charles Garraway, who is one of the team investigating. He's been doing presentations around London, and he was questioned very specifically about the United Nations report on the war in Yemen. And it was strange that he never mentions the Iran factor. So he has been asked, and he's, in some respects, you might say that he's sort of a bit close to Saudi Arabia in some ways, because he was the legal advisor to the British Army for many, many, many years. And, the case legal advice is legal advice to the British government in the pursuit of a kinetic conflict. So he's not, you can't really, he's probably not a member of Stop the War, I would say. But he was asked specifically about the Iran factor, and what he said was, look, this is a complete red herring. There's very little Iranian influence. The Houthi arms and weapons largely come because the previous President Saleh supporting a military establishment was split into two. The Yemeni armed forces were kind of split into two. And this is where the arms come from for the Houthis, not from the Iranians. There's nobody's... people, he said, are people seriously suggesting that the Iranians can manage to get through large-scale weapons through the illegal blockade and across the land border with Saudi Arabia? It's utterly ludicrous. So this is a convenient thing. And what he concluded, so he was asked the question, well, from your work resulting in the UN report, which was published recently, what do you say about the motivations of the parties involved in the conflict? And he said, well, the reason why, he said the main motivation of Saudi Arabia in Yemen is to preempt potential Iranian influence. And this is something he said at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, and he also said the same thing at the Global Strategy Forum in London. So this is an interesting, and I've been searching, the lawyers amongst us, you may be searching the laws of war in order to find a justification for military attack on a neighboring country of preempting potential future influence. And I don't think you're going to find anywhere in international law a justification for attacking another country of potential influence of a neighbor. So I have to, I think we should all feel pretty strongly about this, that the political community in London has been duped. And I have to say, it's a pretty successful campaign to convince people that this is a proxy war between these crazy Iranian mullahs and the kind of our horrible guys in Saudi Arabia. I mean, this kind of narrative, which is what is fed people.
Thank you very much. Very worthwhile getting that information from you. At which point, let's turn to our next panelist. Mahan Abedin is an analyst on Middle East politics and a regular contributor to news websites and satellite television on politics and security. Also the author of Iran Resurgent, The Rise of the Shia State, which is to be published shortly, forthcoming. He's the director of the research group Dysart Consulting. Thanks very much indeed, Mahan Abedin. I feel like what Professor Paul said, is a good segue to your subject, the UK's lukewarm response for the war on Yemen and implications for the region.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Also, thank you for inviting me to this forum. But just on what our last speaker just finished on, I think that's so interesting, and I have to agree with him wholeheartedly. I think there is an issue of potential Iranian influence, not so much in terms of funneling weapons to Yemen or intervening directly, because there's no evidence whatsoever of an Iranian presence in Yemen. There was an issue of arms being funneled through Oman. This came through, and apparently Reuters did a special report on that, but apparently there wasn't much to it. You are absolutely correct in saying that the Yemeni armed forces are split right down the middle. Ali Abdullah Saleh's people, many of their influential officers and those with a lot of access to grind against the Saudis and the Emiratis, they went with the Ansar Allah movement, the so-called Houthis. There is, however, I mean, just to be very fair and to place our discussion on a proper factual footing, there is a lot of uncertainty about the ballistic missile capability, which the Ansar Allah movement has wielded over the past couple of years. There have been at least 2 relatively long-range ballistic missile attacks on Riyadh. Both of them were aborted. One was apparently directed at Riyadh airport. It was brought down by Patriot missiles. And in addition, there have been dozens of short to mid-range ballistic missile attacks on Saudi forces in Jizan and Najran. So we're not entirely sure about the provenance of that capability. Yemen certainly had a very big stockpile of ballistic missiles, and I suspect many of them have been modified to attack the Saudis. But there is also the possibility of some kind of a foreign connection. And the UN actually did an investigation on this, and they came up with some interesting findings, but none of it conclusive. But I certainly wholeheartedly agree with our last speaker. There is, I think, to frame this conflict, as the media often does, as a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia is, I think, it's reductive to the extreme. I mean, the Yemen conflict is so much more than that. But going back to my own talk, I think, well, gosh, if I had the opportunity, I'd really reword the title, because I don't think we can talk about the lukewarm UK response. I would say it's actually a very confused one. And I think, and that's reflecting many issues. I mean, one is to do with the UK's position in the region and more globally. The UK is genuinely confused right now. You know, Brexit is coming along. We don't know where we are in the world, really. You know, the multilateral alliances which have sustained UK foreign policy are coming apart. But I think more specifically in the region, you see, the long-standing British policy of maintaining minimal influence or failing that, the pretense of it, is also coming apart. Because, I mean, the current UK policy was shaped by post-Suez. And more recently, I'd say, with the events in the early 70s, the creation of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, the pivot of regional UK foreign policy toward the smaller Gulf states, and, of course, Saudi Arabia. I would say that's coming apart. And the Yemen conflict, I think, crystallizes that. I mean, what is the UK position on Yemen? Does it have a proper understanding as to the facts on the ground? And also, I think we can make a credible argument that UK policy has ended up emboldening Saudi Arabia, and to an even greater extent the United Arab Emirates. I'll come to that in a minute. To such an extent that UK influence and position becomes more untenable than ever. Because I don't believe how Saudi Arabia is behaving at the moment, its current aggressive foreign policy, not just in respect of Yemen, but remember the Saudi intervention in Lebanon's internal affairs, imprisoning the Lebanese prime minister for a day or so, forcing him to resign on national television. Of course, that backfired terribly on the Saudis. And of course, more recently, with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, I mean, I don't believe anybody in the UK government or the foreign policy community, I don't think any of them approve of these things, or they think they are consistent with British or broader Western interests. But the UK has had such a weak role in this conflict that it's essentially allowed this to happen. Because, I mean, short of selling weapons to the Saudis and to a lesser extent supplying intelligence, the UK hasn't been able to and exert an influential role on the course of the Yemen conflict. And I think the case of the United Arab Emirates, that's even more interesting. Because look, the UAE has arguably a bigger influence on the ground in Yemen right now than the Saudis. For two reasons, actually. One is that the Emiratis are pushing very hard for the dissolution of Yemen. They are supporting southern separatists in the so-called Southern Transitional Council. And the Emirati proxies came into direct blows with the Saudi proxies back in January. There was open fighting in Aden between these gangs. And one reason the Emirati-Saudi coalition has been unable to make any headway in the Houthi heartlands in the north. Not even that, but take Taiz as an example, Yemen's second city. There's been a long-standing siege there now, and the Emiratis and the Saudis have been unable to break through simply because their proxy forces on the ground are divided to the extent of fighting each other, as opposed to the Houthis. And the second thing is the Emiratis have been commissioning some really egregious mercenary forces to carry out political work completely unconnected to the main issue in Yemen. I mean, there was a very good report in one of these American online portals, the Daily Beast, I think, about the fact that the Emiratis had commissioned American and Israeli mercenaries to kill the leaders of the local Muslim Brotherhood, the Al-Islah in Yemen. And this is very egregious because, again, although the Saudis are not friends of the Muslim Brotherhood by any stretch of the imagination, they have tolerated them inside Yemen. And some of the militias connected to Al-Islah have been the most effective forces against the Houthis. So, and I think lastly, on the UAE issue, this case with this British academic who was convicted on national security charges.
Matthew Hedges.
Yeah, I mean I think there's a lot about that case we just don't know. But leaving that aside, I think what that case shows above anything else is the shift in the balance of power. That the Emiratis now see themselves not only as a regional power, but actually a global power. They have a military base in Djibouti. They are undertaking all manner of actions in the region. They are cultivating the Chinese. They're telling the Brits, well, look, the balance of power has shifted here. If you do anything funny, we're gonna take your people out. So, so you could see how British inaction, or simply
Confusion.
Well, inaction and also sustaining a policy which is no longer sustainable, has allowed this situation to develop. But look, I don't want to be too hard on the Brits. Let's not forget that at the diplomatic level, Britain was the leading force behind this new resolution, the draft resolution pushing for a limited ceasefire in Yemen, centered on Hodeidah. Of course, Hodeidah is another front where the Saudis and Emiratis have failed miserably. They started an operation months ago. They've made no headway. And just take into account the sheer imbalance of power. Look, I mean, they have all the firepower at their disposal, not just in the air, but also the assets they have on the ground. The Houthis really are fighting with very rudimentary weapons, but they have the spirit and the ideology. And I think going back to our previous speaker, this is what the Saudis are really scared of. And this is one area where we can point to an Iranian influence, albeit an ideological one, because if you look at the Houthi discourse now, it's very similar to the pro-Iranian groups across the region, Hezbollah and the rest. I mean, they start any political pronunciation with death to America, death to Israel. So if you're a Western audience, that's not going to instill a lot of confidence. So there are reasons why people have, are very skeptical about the Ansar Allah movement. And the Saudis, of course, are very, very scared, because here you have a group that has essentially adopted the Iranian ideology, the political discourse or the worldview, and it's right on their backyard. I mean, the Houthis have taken the fight inside Saudi Arabia. There is a lot of fighting in Najran as we speak. They've gone deep inside Saudi territory, and of course this terrifies them. But looking forward, I think, look, I mean, we'll see how the peace talks continue in Stockholm. I think a limited ceasefire is possible, and I think the UK can still play a positive role. I mean, stopping the exportation of weapons and using the influence that the UK still has on the Saudi UAE military security establishment, using that to good effect could still bring about some kind of a positive outcome, but only insofar as getting a ceasefire in place. But Yemen's problems go much more than that. I mean, there's obviously a humanitarian issue right now, but the political crisis in Yemen is going to continue long after that ceasefire, because there are many fault lines. And I would say the biggest fault line right now isn't between the people of the north and the Adenese, not between the Houthis or this so-called central government in Aden. The biggest fault line is the proper north-south divide. There's a strong separatist movement in Yemen. There's also an issue of extremism. There are jihadist groups active in Yemen, both Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State. They're active. Some of their splinters are allied with the Saudis, some with the Emiratis, a very confused picture on the ground. But there are many, many issues there that need to be resolved. But I think getting a limited ceasefire on the ground could be a good start.
All right, I've actually just got an update. Thank you, Mahan. Please. I've just seen this update. The New York Times has just released an update saying that Yemen's warring sides agreed on Thursday to exchange prisoners, starting peace consultations in Sweden that aim to end the conflict. So that's how they've kicked off by with that agreement. But I just wanted to follow up with you, Mahan, about the internal situation in Saudi, because there is a narrative that MBS is a reformer, and that this might inform UK policy in the sense that, look, this guy is a reformer, whatever he's doing, we want to support it, we don't want to kind of create a gap in order to project our values, as it were.
Well, there's definitely a vacuous reform movement in Saudi Arabia, but it relates to social and cultural issues, like allowing women to drive, for instance, or loosening the social strictures. There is no reform movement at the political level.
They're imprisoning the women, the activists who lobbied for women to be able to drive.
That's because the Saudis want to say, we are the ones who gave you the right to drive, not these activists. They want to make that distinction very clear. But look, Saudi, what Mohammed bin Salman and his clique have been doing is to try to create a coherent regime in Riyadh. This has never existed before in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family is splintered into different factions. They're basically trying to go beyond that factionalism and have a coherent regime. But I don't think it will work, simply because the Saudis, they don't have the institutional coherence for that. You know, I mean, most of their expertise is still run by foreigners. They're reliant on foreigners for so many things. And you could see that also in the way they've managed the Yemen conflict. They tried to prosecute a Western-style military campaign. If you look at their the way they handle the media angle of it, there you have a Saudi general on TV like Norman Schwarzkopf during the first Gulf War saying, oh, we've bombed this, we've bombed that. So try to create a veneer of professionalism and lethality, but in actual fact, the war has been anything but efficient. I mean, the Saudis have spent a lot of money, and they've obviously inflicted a lot of damage on Yemeni society. But look, they've brought the war into their own country. Some of the most serious fighting now is happening inside Saudi borders. It's not inside Yemen. And you can see how weak Saudi Arabia is potentially militarily. I mean, this is not hyperbolic, but I think under the right conditions, the Houthis can go all the way to Riyadh. Honestly, I mean, the Saudi ground forces are very weak. If they didn't have that ultimate Western security umbrella, if the British and the Americans didn't guarantee their security, the Saudis couldn't even hold their own capital. So this is not, in my view, a very strong state. and you know, faced with a with a big threat and can collapse. But of course they have that security umbrella. The Americans will guarantee their security.
Thanks very much. We're going to talk more in a minute, but we must, of course, speak to our last panelist. Before we do, I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to indulge in a little dark humour from my a former colleague of mine. You may remember on the 21st of November, US President Donald Trump praised Saudi Arabia for helping to lower oil prices as pressure intensified on the United States to do something about the Jamal Khashoggi murder. And a friend of mine writes limericks on Twitter, and he wrote, "I'll stand by the Saudis," said Trump. "Their critics can go take a jump. Who cares who they're slaying so long as we're paying a few dollars less at the pump?" I think this might be a very important factor. What do you think? Bill Law joins us. He is a journalist with the BBC who has worked extensively in the Gulf states and the wider Middle East. And he's going to speak to us about how to bring pressure to bear on the UK government to reverse its policy on Saudi Arabia. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. I should say that I'm no longer with the BBC. I haven't been with the BBC for 4 years. And I now have my own company called thegulfmatters.com. And thank you to the Arab Organization for Human Rights for inviting me. I've enjoyed very much the conversation from my co-panelists. And of course, the problem with being last is I may end up repeating some of the points that have been made, but that's okay, because it'll make me look rather more clever than I actually am. Okay. So the title, How to Bring Pressure to Bear on the UK Government to Reverse Its Policy on Saudi Arabia. Well, let me begin by stating that the UK government will not reverse its long-standing policy on Saudi Arabia. There is far too much at stake in these febrile Brexit times, with that 11 p.m. March 29, 2019 deadline looming ever and ever closer for our government to contemplate, even if they had the wherewithal and the capacity, a fundamental reshaping of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Let me mention what's at stake in the relationship. First and foremost, the billions and billions in weapons sales, then the security commitment between us and the Saudis. You'll recall that the Blair government declined to pursue the bribery investigation of the BAE Al Yamamah scandal after the Saudis had threatened to withdraw from our joint security arrangement. At the time, 2006 it was adjudged that we needed that arrangement for the protection of our citizens against terrorist attacks. There's also the historic friendship between the Saudis and the British that is always drawn out by ambassadors and politicians at various state occasions and trade and diplomatic missions, rather like a somewhat decrepit elder relation. That's the one that argues that we have a very special and unique link to the Gulf states thanks to the old ties of empire and to the ruling family's seemingly insatiable appetite for all things to do with British royalty. And there could be little question that in addition to the arms trade, Vision 2030, Mohammed bin Salman's radical restructuring of the Saudi economy and society does present some further business opportunities for the UK, though British businesses attempting to exploit those opportunities are finding that the hype doesn't yet meet the reality, and that getting in the door and doing business with the Saudis is still too often, to quote the song, the same as it always was. So the idea that our policy approach can be put into reverse is not going to result in much more than a grinding of the gears, and those of us who've taught our kids to drive know what that sounds like. However, we can consider a calibrated approach that builds on a number of opportunities. For the moment, Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis who support him are on the back foot. The brutal and clumsy murder of my colleague Jamal Khashoggi and the inept and obvious support for MBS from Donald Trump. I'll give you a pass on killing that journalist. You keep the price of petrol down at the pump. Has rankled Washington. As we saw on Tuesday, powerful Republican senators like Lindsey Graham and Bob Corker are not prepared to let sleeping dogs lie. They're angry. And why? Not because a good man was murdered, though they say that is the reason. No, it is because they feel betrayed. They feel embarrassed and humiliated by someone they thought of as a useful friend and pliable ally. After all, they'd backed MBS to the hilt as he blundered through a series of catastrophic foreign adventures. How could he let them down so badly? And of those blunders, first and foremost is the war in Yemen, which is now closing in on 4 years. Mohammed bin Salman, rather like Blackadder's Baldric, thought he had a clever plan. The plan was to win a quick, decisive victory to confirm his stature as a military leader, placing him in the same league as his grandfather, Ibn Saud, the great warrior king and founder of the modern-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The war, he thought, would last 2, maybe 3 weeks, as Saudi air power destroyed the Houthi militia. The Americans and us, we backed him from the beginning, with logistical support such as mid-air fueling of fighter jets, coordinate sighting of targets that was supposed to limit civilian casualties. Well, we know how badly wrong that went. And of course, the ongoing sale of bombs. The war in Yemen is costing Saudis something in excess of $5 billion a month. Now, that figure gives you an idea of just how lucrative the arms trade is. And the war that was supposed to burnish his credentials and be over oh so quickly, that war grinds on with terrible consequence for the people of Yemen. That one blunder, in all its horror, should have been sufficient to give our government some backbone. But it hasn't, and there are plenty more blunders. Mohammed bin Salman, together with his mentor, Mohammed bin Zayed, the Abu Dhabi crown prince and effective ruler of the United Arab Emirates, thought it would be a good idea to dump all of the responsibility for global terror in the laps of their fellow Gulf Cooperation Council member, Qatar. The Saudis and the Emiratis, joined by Egypt and Bahrain, launched an air, land, and sea blockade of Qatar last June. And the Qataris were expected to sign over their sovereignty and capitulate to the Saudis in a matter of days. They haven't. They have seen out the blockade, and now many experts say they're in better shape than when it began. And where was Britain to attempt to rein in this folly when it first commenced? Nowhere useful that I can see. Next up was the seizure of the Lebanese Prime Minister, Said Hariri, when he was on a visit to Riyadh. He was forced to resign via a televised speech. It was the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who rushed in to save the day, not our Foreign Office. Hariri, after a few days in Paris, made his way back to Beirut and announced that, no, he was not resigning after all. The same day that Hariri was frog-marched in front of the TV camera to read his capitulation speech, Mohammed bin Salman launched a raid on senior members of the ruling family and the merchant elite. They were banged up in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and under the direction of Mohammed bin Salman's chief thug, Saud al-Qahtani, more of him later, they were verbally abused, physically beaten, and forced to turn over their billions and their businesses. Though the Saudi authorities said there would be due process, there was none. And I cannot recall our government expressing at the time or since any firm criticism of what was a classic mafia shakedown and a fundamental abuse of these individuals' human rights. Perhaps the special relationship, that great friendship, got in the way. And in August of this year, when the Saudis went ballistic over a comment the Canadian foreign minister made about human rights abuses inflicted on Saudi women, I don't believe I even heard a tut-tut from Downing Street, despite the fact that the Saudis kicked out the Canadian ambassador, recalled theirs, halted trade, ordered thousands of their students studying in Canadian universities to come home, and then, via their foreign minister, demanded that Canada apologize. The whole thing was a tantrum of breathtaking arrogance and rudeness. It should have given the UK pause for serious thought about the personality and behavior of Mohammed bin Salman, but it did not. And so we come to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Every independent source, including the CIA, says what we all know is true, that the murder of Jamal was carried out on the instructions of Mohammed bin Salman. The CIA intercepted electronic messages showing he was in close contact with his chief thug, Saud al-Qahtani, before and after the murder. It was Qahtani who oversaw from Riyadh the seizure, torture, murder, and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. Jean Haspel, the head of the CIA, gave a presentation to a select group of senators on the 4th of December. That was enough to convince them that MBS had ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And what did our government say about that terrible crime? At the time, and as the Saudi lies unraveled over the next 2 months, not very much at all. I cannot help but wonder if we had been more robust about Yemen, about Hariri and the Ritz-Carlton shakedown, about Qatar, about the roundup of women activists and the attack on Canada, would Jamal be alive today? Because through our passivity and acquiescence, We empowered Mohammed bin Salman. We granted impunity to a brutal and murderous bully. It was the sentencing in the UAE of the researcher Matthew Hedges to life imprisonment on the patently bogus charge that he was a British spy that finally aroused the old lion into action. And to his credit, Jeremy Hunt, unlike his pusillanimous predecessors, roared loud and clear, and it had an effect. The UAE listened, and thank God Matthew Hedges is safe back in the UK. I add a caveat, however. It was his brave and resourceful wife, Daniela Tejeda, who after 5 months of listening to counsel from the Foreign Office to stay stumm, said, "Sod this," and went to the media. So to come back to the topic, can we reverse our policy towards Saudi Arabia? No, we cannot. But can we calibrate it? Can we expect and indeed demand change? Well, yes, we can. First and foremost, with the Yemen war. Others before me have said this, but I'll say it again. Stop selling bombs to the Saudis. As we speak, a bill is before the American Senate calling for an end to weapons sales used against Yemen. We need to, just for one moment, set aside our grand obsession with Brexit. We need to look up and look out and see all the horror this war has caused. Yemeni children are starving to death by the tens of thousands. Our political leaders need to show just a little bit of courage. The Germans have taken steps, so have the Danish, the Norwegians, and the French may not be far behind. A bill that calls for the immediate cessation of the air war, an end to UK sales of weaponry used in the conflict, and unqualified support for the peace talks due to start in Sweden. Well, that would be a good beginning. But that should be followed up by political will and political pressure. MBS is vulnerable now, more so than ever, and the UK should have the courage to exploit that vulnerability to bring an end to the war. And perhaps Jeremy Hunt is the man to do it. But we need to do more. The Matthew Hedges case underlines how easily British academic institutions have been seduced by the Gulf ruling families. Academic freedom has been sacrificed on the altar of easy money and the lure of establishing overseas campuses. We need strong action and strong statements in order to defend academic freedom. And if that means withdrawing campuses from authoritarian Gulf states, so be it. We need to speak up about the appalling human rights record of these states. We need to champion the true patriots, those who have given unstintingly to defend the very qualities we hold most dear to our democracy: free speech, free association, free media, the right to criticize, the right to think and act critically. They have been detained, these Gulf patriots. They've been abused and sentenced to long imprisonment in manifestly unfair trials. Their families are suffering enormously. So, lest we forget, here's just a partial list of some of those patriots. In the UAE, the academic and economist Dr. Nasser bin Ghaith and the human rights activist Ahmed Mansour. In Bahrain, the activists Nabil Rajab and Abdelhadi Al-Hawaja. There are many more in the UAE and Bahrain that I could name. In Saudi Arabia, the blogger Raif Badawi, the women's rights activist Lujain Al-Hathlul, the moderate Sheikh Salman Al-Uda, and again, many, many more. The list should trouble us deeply. It should pull at our consciences and call out our hypocrisies and our double standards. The list is long, it's very long, and it's too long to be ignored. So we need to ask our government to stop the silence, to stop ignoring the daily abuse of human rights, and if the government will not, well, we need to find ways to embarrass it into action. We need to demand of Bahrain that it allow the only independent news site in the Gulf, Al-Wasat, to be reopened. Al-Wasat was shuttered last August, and its closure caused not even a ripple in Whitehall. We need to support those brave journalists and citizen journalists throughout the region who have the courage to question authority and challenge abuse. When Ahmed Mansour was seized in March of last year, I wrote, he knew that one night the men in black balaclavas would arrive and seize him. I asked him once why he persisted in going down a road that would lead again to his incarceration. He said, the only way to counter repression is by revealing it. And yes, there's always that possibility that I will go back to jail. But if we activists do not talk, who will? For me, that question hangs in the air. If we do not talk, who will? I said then, and I repeat it now, for all those murdered, incarcerated, disappeared, we will, Ahmed, we will. And if enough of us do speak up, then yes, in small, incremental, decent steps, we can begin to reverse our government's policy on Saudi Arabia.
Thanks very much indeed. We will ask questions from the audience in a moment, and I'm sure there'll be lots of them, but I wanted to sort of get things going by putting a question to everybody and have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves. Unfortunately, as I say, we've only got the two mics, and in fact, we might only have one mic now. She's taken one. So we'll just have to be very polite and pass it to each other if you don't mind. And I'm sure you can hear anyway. It was not that big of a room. But, you know, I wanted to mention a paper that was written by Armida van Fye. Is it? I can't put my glasses on. Van Rij and Benedict Wilkinson at the Policy Institute at King's, and it was funded by the Oxford Research Group on Remote Warfare Programme. It's a paper that was called Security Cooperation with Saudi Arabia. Is it worth it for the UK? And it seems that, to me, that is quite irrelevant. Their conclusions might be quite relevant for our conversation right now. Their point being that, in fact, the UK is undergoing a period of profound soul-searching in the wake of the June 2016 vote to leave the European Union. And given that, the UK-Saudi Arabia relationship is a microcosm of all the difficult choices the UK is going to have to make once it has left the EU. There are serious but as of yet unanswered questions about the role the UK wants to pursue on the world stage, who it will seek to do this with, and how it will financially account for this. More specifically, which military and diplomatic capabilities should the UK maintain and which no longer bring added value in today's world? Now, we talked a bit about the security, the importance of the security aspect of the Saudi-UK relationship. They would say, for example, that there is an exchange of intelligence, not just arms, that goes on in that relationship. What do you think, guys, if I ask you, what difference would it make in actual fact were the UK to stop providing arms to Saudi Arabia? Who wants to start? Yes?
Shall I use the mic? Yeah, please. Well, I think in terms of the difference it would make, I think the very real-term short difference would be to the war in Yemen, because obviously UK arms are being directly used. In terms of the broader relationship, nobody would suggest that the UK should have no relationship whatsoever with Saudi Arabia. Nobody would suggest that all political and economic cooperation must come to an end right now. And in fact, I don't believe that the Saudi regime would then knowingly allow terrorism, for example, to be committed on the streets of the UK simply because it's not buying billions of pounds worth of bombs. And if that is the argument, if the government's argument is if we don't continue selling them billions of pounds worth of bombs, they'll allow atrocities to happen in the UK, then it doesn't sound like a partnership you want to be going into in the first place. But I also don't believe it's true. I think it's a fig leaf which is put up. It would also, might I add, be against international law to knowingly cover up the violating UN rules to knowingly allow terrorism anyway. But I think there is a broader question of relationship, and I think the immediate impact would be on the war in Yemen, which would be infinitely harder to prosecute without the weapons from the UK and the US specifically. I mean, we've talked about the arms transfers from Finland and Denmark, for example, and I think it's a good thing they've stopped, but they were very, very small quantities of arms to begin with. I think actually, if I remember correctly, Denmark had licensed, I think, £200,000 worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia in the last 2 years. So it isn't a significant amount, and I'm not sure it was weapons which were being used in the war in Yemen in the first place. I think the issue with the Arms Trade Treaty is that it's a fairly, for the large transfers, I think it's a fairly poor piece of legislation. It's one which definitely needs a lot of work. Might have that all being said, it's not to in any way discourage Finland, Denmark, or minor arms sellers from stopping selling arms to Saudi. Of course they should, absolutely 100%. But the war could not be fought without American and British support. It can be fought without Danish and Finnish support, and that's where I think there's a particular responsibility in the UK and the US to act in this case. I don't think that we would see an end to relationship with Saudi Arabia. In fact, I think it would continue, but it wouldn't be one which is based on arms sales to the extent it is today. Yeah, sure. Well, it would have an immediate impact insofar as the fighter jets are UK fighter jets. If those licenses were revoked and those fighter jets were not able to fly, or if the licenses for bombs were revoked or suspended and when those bombs and missiles could not be used, it would have a direct impact, yeah. And we always hear the counter-argument, which is always made, is that if they didn't buy these weapons from the UK, they'd simply... but, I mean, the trouble is that while there's a broader point about this, which is that it's highly possibly true that in the long term Saudi Arabia or somebody else may well start buying more weapons from France, Germany or Russia for sake of argument, or China, for any country for sake of argument, certainly that is not actually the part which is making the prosecution of the war possible, because I don't believe that China or Russia or any other large arms exporter could produce anywhere near the fighter jets required for war and send them over and train people up to use them within such a short period of time.
Maybe we do need another mic.
Shall I just use this one?
Yeah, please.
But on that issue, though, Saudi Arabia has already diversified its arms supplies. Saudi Arabia acquired long-range ballistic missiles from the Chinese in 1987, over 30 years ago. So, there's already supply chains in there. But I mean, I agree with you. I think, you know, it would have an immediate impact in terms of the air war, and that's critical to the Yemen conflict. But I think the broader military issue is one about emotions as well. I mean, the bonding between the Saudi military and the UK military and also the American military. And I think the emotional side is important, not so much in the relationship between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, but between the US and Saudi Arabia. Remember, the origin of that relationship predates Suez. It was immediately after the Second World War that the then US president met the then Saudi king in the Red Sea on the deck of that destroyer. And so the Americans are emotionally wedded to the Saudi leadership. And I think until we can get beyond that, we're not really going to make much headway. But I think on that specific questions, I believe that if the arms sales, if these procurement lines were curtailed, it would have an immediate impact in terms of the aerial assaults by both Saudi and the Emiratis. But the fighting on the ground will continue because these are proxies which are well armed, and both the Saudis and the Emiratis have the ability to keep these proxy groups and the gangs and all the various militias that are fighting on the ground. They have the capability to both supply them and to guide them on the ground. So without some kind of a political framework, yeah, I think that fighting will continue. And just one additional point, and maybe some of the other speakers will pick up on that, it's not just about the supply of arms. I think both the British and the Americans are involved in terms of intelligence sharing with the Saudis and Emiratis to the extent of actually targeting inside the Yemen conflict. And the British are heavily involved in that, helping both the Saudis and the Emiratis in picking up targets, you know, identify.
The targeting rooms.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, the British MOD produces software for the Emiratis to basically identify, you know, targets of interest inside Yemen. Yeah. And this is like software that's very information rich. It's picking up, you know, military information, tribal information, right down to the subsets, if you like. So there's a lot of involvement there. Yeah.
Yeah, could I just pick up on this conversation too, because early on in the war, I was at a press conference when Ahmed al-Asiri, who was then the voice of the Saudi campaign, and was assuring journalists and others present that this war was being conducted with all due process and with great care given to civilians. There were no civilian targets on the ground that were being attacked, and it was put to him because even then there were concerns, because it was clear there were civilian targets being hit and being hit repeatedly. What would be the response of the Saudi government if Britain indeed stopped supplying the bombs? And he looked out at us and said, well, you know, we can always go anywhere else and get our bombs. We can buy them anywhere else. And of course, the bombs that you make for us, it creates jobs. And I think that's very important, isn't it? And Asiri was rewarded because then he was named the deputy intel chief for Mohammed bin Salman. And of course, Asiri is the other guy in the frame for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I would like to see, and I'm not a defense expert by any stretch, but I would like to see that bluff called. Because the fact of the matter is the British and the Americans have for years been the main providers of weaponry. And these systems are complicated, they're integrated. You can't just, it's not like going to, you know, one fried chicken outlet and saying, I don't like your chicken anymore, and then going to the one next door.
Like
It's
UK and Chinese technology.
well, exactly, and in fact, the Americans for years have been trying to get the Gulf states to integrate the various pieces, components they've got because of concerns about Iran. Now, really, do you think that with the Saudis and the Emiratis so concerned about the threat of Iran that they were simply going to say to the Brits and the Americans, should that bill pass, you know what? If you don't sell them to us, we'll get them somewhere else. I don't think it's that easy, and I would like to see that bluff called. I really would. And as I say, I'm not a defense expert, but I am told by people who know this that it's not a simple task to simply go and shop somewhere else.
I think only in relation to the air forces, it's easier with the other components, with the land forces and everything.
But the air forces are critical in this war. Yeah, yeah.
I think, Paul, did you want to put this? I wondered about putting this in the context of the domestic political the situation, especially because we talked about jobs in the UK. I don't know who was it who mentioned that. Apparently, there are like 6,000 to 9,000 people who would lose their jobs were the UK not to supply arms to Saudi Arabia, for example. How do you weigh these things in the UK political world?
Well, the question, my voice is nearly gone. I will try. I might not be able to make it. The question of arms, the impact of reducing arms exports from the UK is a question, first of all, about the economics of the BAE company, which is the main supplier, and there are lots of reasons why a proper consideration of the benefits of this trade point to it being long-term disbeneficial for the UK. First of all, the actual economics of the BAE and the exports, because there are lots of hidden subsidies to BAE in one way or another. And going back, we had these offset arrangements, and we had DESO and all these kind of things, very large sums of money being spent around the contracts, as well as nobody really ever calculates whether these contracts are profitable or not. And so, there are lots of ways in which just the straight overall economics, including the fiscal factors, make the UK arms industry disbeneficial for the UK. One way is that so much of British technology and an extraordinary proportion of UK R&D is military related. And so this is taking expertise and resources away from companies that are producing automobiles or whatever it is. So this is draining resources from the UK. The question of the sales to Saudi Arabia in particular, well, you have to put that in a bit of a context, which, Saudi Arabia, after all, it's a sovereign nation. They will always be buying weapons from somebody, just as Thailand or Bolivia will be arming itself, and there's competition for the contracts. So So in these senses, a review of the economics of the arms trade, the size of it in the UK, is long overdue. The reason, but not to say that Saudi Arabia shouldn't be allowed to buy arms at all, that's absurd. But there's this special relationship which goes very deep into the British establishment, and it's these sorts of contracts which support this system, and the British may never get away from this unless they're forced to, because it's so embedded in the UK political system. There are so many people making so much money, and when you talk about the loss of jobs, it's the loss of very high-paid jobs, especially from the people who are intermediaries, and people involved in politics in the UK making very, very many millions out of it. And these are influential people. So it's really very embedded, and it's not the sort of thing, if you reduce the arms sales to a kind of more normal level, well, really you'd need quite a long-term strategy for how to deal with this. But because they're not dealing with it, supplying such large quantities of arms to a regime which is really unsustainable. Can you imagine, 200 years from now, there being an absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia, with the role of women in the legal system and so on as it is now? I mean, it's a kind of feudal system. So it's not going to go on forever. So something like this happening now, if it's not Khashoggi, it's something else in the future, because these are unstable regimes. It will come to an end. And therefore, the British, if we're selling widgets around the world like Japan does, if Mozambique or Bolivia economy collapses, it doesn't have a big impact on Japan. But we're rather over-dependent on these arms sales. And so that's a very, very vulnerable thing for the UK. It will come to an end one day, and I absolutely bet you bottom dollar we won't be prepared for it.
Actually, I wanted to pick up on something. Where does UK government interests and BAE interests, where do they begin and end?
I'll tell you a little story. I'm associated with the UK Liberal Democrats in a sad sort of way. Anyway, when the party was in coalition with the Conservative Party from 2010, we had a minister in the Defence Department. And he said, when I went to meetings in the Ministry of Defence, if you didn't know, you would not be able to tell which was an official and which was a BAE employee. He said sometimes the BAE officers, the BAE staff, were speaking on behalf of the government policy, and sometimes the MOD officials were speaking, on behalf of, promoting the expansion of BAE business. So it's such a close relationship that, the MOD and BAE is, in practical terms, they're not really separate organizations. And let's not forget, in the UK, if you're a politician, you may have seen the news about Boris Johnson, you have to register your interests. In the United Kingdom, civil servants do not have to register any interests. In fact, it's entirely legal for a British civil servant to single source a large-scale contract and, without competition, and be a significant shareholder in the supplier. That's legal in the UK, the only country in the OECD where that's legal. And so, therefore, and I know, I've studied this in some great depth, and many people got very angry about it. But, that is the case. And so, these things are very, very, very close indeed, and it will take a very long time to unravel. But that's a separate question to the question of stopping arms sales to Saudi Arabia, because that's something which, is not a kind of 20-year plan. This is something that happens that we would hope would happen kind of next week, and specifically because of the Yemen war, And so if there's a peace deal in Yemen and the war stops, and perhaps MBS will be, there'll be a quiet words in people's ears, especially in Washington, and MBS stands down and we have a new a leader. Under those circumstances, the rest of the world might be happy about that, especially the Middle East, but it still leaves the UK with the problem of overdependence on arms sales in its industrial capacity.
Okay, did you want to say something? Oh, okay. Is it, yes, I'd like to open the discussion to the floor, if I may, guys. What should I do? Do you want to have do you want to just, can you pick up the audio?